There are a number of presumed contradictions in the Bible. Some are due to copying errors. Some are due to reader interpretation and translation. And some are due to writers' perspective, in which different writers describe the same event, but from their own perspectives with their own emphasis. In this video, we will assess the presumed contradiction regarding the biblical account of the creation. Critics of the Bible claim there is a contradiction regarding the timing of the creation of the plants and the creation of man. In Genesis chapter 1 verses 11 to 13, the Bible teaches that plants and trees were created on the third day. And verses 26 to 27 teach that man was created on the sixth day, which means man was created after the plants and trees. However, in Genesis chapter 2 verses 5 to 9, the Bible appears to teach that man was created before there were any plants in the trees. So, were the plants and trees created before man as described in Genesis chapter 1? Or was man created before the plants and the trees as described in Genesis chapter 2? One theory for reconciling this apparent contradiction is that Genesis chapter 1 is referring to a broad description of the whole world, and Genesis chapter 2 is referring to a description specific to the Garden of Eden. So, the theory is that in the creation account in Genesis chapter 1, God created the plants on day 3 all over the world, and then God created man on day 6. Then, in Genesis chapter 2, the creation account is retold, but from the perspective in the Garden of Eden. So, although there were trees and plants all over the world, none had been created in the Garden of Eden until after man was created. Although this is a plausible explanation, this video presents an alternative theory based on the interpretation of Genesis chapter 1 verse 11 compared to Genesis chapter 2 verse 5. Because this theory is based on what the proper translation of the Bible should be, we begin first by identifying which Bible translations offer the most literal translation of the original scripture. It appears some of the most literal translations of the Bible include the New American Standard Bible, the English Standard Version, the New English Translation, and the King James Version. A comparison of Genesis chapter 1 verse 11 and Genesis chapter 2 verse 5 of each of these versions will quickly reveal a common pattern. The words chosen to describe the plants in Genesis chapter 1 verse 11 were not the same words chosen to describe the plants in Genesis chapter 2 verse 5. In each of these versions, Genesis chapter 1 refers to plants yielding seed and trees bearing fruit. But Genesis chapter 2 refers to shrubs, bushes, small plants and herbs. So, why would the author of Genesis chapter 1 and Genesis chapter 2 use different words to describe the same plants and trees? The theory presented in this video is that the plants and the trees referred to in Genesis chapter 1 verse 11 were referring to fully grown plants and trees, whereas the herbs, shrubs, and small plants referred to in Genesis chapter 2 verse 5 were referring to young baby plants and trees that were to be reproduced from the seeds of the existing plants from Genesis chapter 1 verse 11. Therefore, plants and trees were formed on day 3 as fully grown and mature as described in Genesis chapter 1, but these fully grown plants had not yet reproduced to form the new, baby plants and trees before the creation of man as described in Genesis chapter 2. So, what basis do we have for such a theory? We look to some of the Bible translations that are thought to be the most literal translations. Each of these versions has Genesis chapter 1 verse 11 expressly stating that the plants were already bearing seeds and that the trees were already bearing fruit. Therefore, these plants and trees were already fully grown and mature, bearing seed and bearing fruit. However, turning to Genesis chapter 2 verse 5, we see that the Bible is likely referring to baby trees that have not yet been reproduced, and baby plants that have not yet grown on their own from seed in the ground. In the NASB, instead of referring to trees bearing fruit, the NASB refers to shrubs. And instead of plants bearing seed, the NASB refers to plants that have not yet sprouted, presumably from a seed. In the ESV, instead of referring to trees bearing fruit, the ESV refers to bushes. And, instead of plants bearing seed, the ESV refers to small plants, presumably from a seed. The NET is even more specific. Instead of referring to trees bearing fruit, the NET refers to shrubs that had yet grown. And, instead of plants bearing seed, the NET refers to plants that had yet sprouted, presumably from a seed. In the King James Version, instead of referring to trees bearing fruit, the King James Version refers to every plant. And instead of plants bearing seed, the King James Version refers to herbs, before it grew, which is consistent with the herbs not having grown from a seed. So, a common theme emerges. In Genesis chapter 1 verse 11, each version refers to fully grown trees and plants that were formed by God and not from seed. These plants and trees were already bearing fruit and seed. By contrast, Genesis chapter 2 verse 5 refers to bushes, shrubs, and small plants, which are all smaller than fully grown trees, and must be referring to baby trees and plants that have not been formed through reproduction of the mature trees and plants. To further support this theory, we can turn to the next phrase in Genesis chapter 2 verse 5, which explains why there were no plants that had formed out of reproduction. Specifically, each version consistently states that there was no rain and there was no man to till the ground. If a tree or plant is fully grown, as in Genesis chapter 1 verse 11, there is no need for man to till the ground. On the other hand, tilling of the ground may be required to grow new trees and plants from seed, which would explain why there were no new, baby trees and plants in Genesis chapter 2 verse 5. But what about the water? If there was no rain to water the trees and plants, how could the fully grown trees and plants sustain themselves? Genesis chapter 2 verse 6 states that a mist or spring watered the whole earth. A spring or mist could be sufficient to keep the ground moist or wet enough to water the developed roots in fully grown trees. However, a mist may not be able to penetrate the ground enough to provide water for seeds, and a spring could be too powerful and flood or wash away the seed. So, the timing of the creation of plants and trees and man in Genesis chapter 1 verse 11 and Genesis chapter 2 verse 5 can be reconciled if it is understood that fully grown mature plants and trees bearing fruit and having seed were created on day 3 is recorded in Genesis chapter 1 verse 11. Then man was created on day 6 is recorded in Genesis chapter 1 verse 27, which was before baby trees and plants had sprouted from seed through reproduction is recorded in Genesis chapter 2 verse 5. Now, if you thought this presumed contradiction could not be reconciled, but it has been reconciled here, then couldn't all the apparent contradictions be reconciled whether we know it now or find out later? So, the question is, are you willing to risk your salvation by choosing not to believe the Bible because of a presumed contradiction that could end up having a rational explanation? If so, then remember to refuse the mark.